Don turned around and poured gasoline on me. I want you to say it again. Did I understand you correctly? He turned around and poured gasoline on you, is that right? Yes. These are the words of Robbie Middleton, an 8-year-old boy who was the victim of a brutal attack that put his life in danger. The investigation into this case dragged on for years until Robbie made an honest and shocking statement. Robbie Middleton was born on June 28, 1990, in Splendora, Texas, USA. He grew up in a loving family, consisting of his parents Bobby and Colleen Middleton and his older sister Heather, who lived in a small community where everyone knew everyone. Robbie was described as a friendly, polite, and curious child. Like many other children his age, he enjoyed spending his free time outdoors, but above all, he loved to go camping. Robbie had long dreamed of having his own tent, and when he turned 8, his parents decided to make this dream come true. This day was supposed to be the best day of his life, but unfortunately the exact opposite was the case. June 28, 1998 began as the happiest day for the entire Middleton family. As soon as Robbie woke up, his parents showered him with love and gave him 2 gifts, a large box and a small envelope. When the boy opened the box, he could hardly contain his joy. He immediately recognized that it was the tent he had dreamed of for so long. After thanking his parents, he began to open the envelope, which contained a very large sum of money, at least for an 8-year-old child. Some time later, Robbie announced that he wanted to use the tent to celebrate his birthday with his best friend. Robbie asked his parents if he could set up the tent in the yard and buy fireworks to light during the birthday party. And not only did they allow it, but they also accompanied him to the shopping center to buy what was needed. After making his purchases, Robbie waited until dusk to pick up his friend who lived in the same community but on the other side of the woods. Although the place was remote and poorly lit, the boy had gotten used to passing through it without fear of getting into trouble. On this day, however, things changed, and he was attacked in an incredibly brutal way. He was tied to a tree with a fishnet, then doused with gasoline and set on fire. And though he screamed in pain, no one heard him. Ironically, it was this pain that kept him from passing out and dying. When the net holding him burned away, he was able to jump aside. Literally, with his last ounce of strength, he crawled onto the road that led to his house. At the same moment, Robbie's neighbors, who were just coming home from work, noticed him crawling out of the woods. At first, they thought Robbie's clothes looked as if they were dirty with mud. As they got closer, however, it became clear that he was not dirty at all, but burned. He looked terrible. His body was still smoking and smelled of gasoline. His eyes were completely white, his skin was melted, and his eyelids, lips, hair, and genitals were completely charred. One of Robbie's neighbors noticed a cloud of smoke rising from the woods and hurried over to make sure the fire was no longer burning. After moving about 100 meters from the road, he discovered the source of the fire. A small tree was almost completely burned by the flames. The ground around the tree was soaked with gasoline, and there was a distinct smell of gasoline in the air. Meanwhile, Robbie kept repeating that he couldn't see anything, that he was cold, and that he was very thirsty. One of the neighbors offered him water, a blanket, and ice. Fortunately, someone in the crowd knew about first aid for burns. This person warned the others not to touch Robbie or give him anything to drink, as this could worsen his already poor condition. While the neighbors were still trying to help the boy, his parents were already seriously worried about his absence. When they stepped out of the house, they saw a group of people crowding at the end of the street and calling for help. Instinctively, they rushed to them and found the child with severe burns all over his body. Colleen recognized Robbie's red sneakers and knew immediately that this burned boy was her son. Everyone began to ask Robbie what had happened to him, whether it had been an accident or if someone had attacked him. At first, the boy didn't seem to know what to say, but finally Robbie said that a teenager named Rex Taylor had thrown gasoline in his face. At that moment, the first ambulance arrived at the scene. A short time later, Robbie was taken to a small hospital in Houston, but due to the severity of his injuries, he was immediately transferred to a medical center in Galveston. Robbie's parents were later informed that 99% of his body was covered with third-degree burns. This information meant that the boy had virtually no chance of survival. Robbie was immediately taken to the operating room where most of the burned skin was removed. There, they began to replace it with skin grown in a lab. The only part of the boy's body that was not burned was a small segment on his right leg. From this, specialists grew thousands of small pieces of skin that would later be transplanted. Against all odds, Robbie survived. However, his life became an endless stay in various medical centers. The investigation into the circumstances of the incident began the very next day. Through questioning neighbors, it became known that Robbie had pointed to a teenager named Rex as the person who had attacked him. Rex himself, however, claimed that at the time of the incident he was swimming in the river with his friends. Since all the young men willingly cooperated with the authorities, the investigators ruled them out as suspects. As there were no leads, the investigation of the case reached a dead end. However, the police soon had a new suspect, Donald Wilborn Collins, a 13-year-old with a bad reputation. He was reportedly born in 1985. Little was known about his parents and his childhood. His mother died when he was about 8 years old, after which he moved in with his father, from whom he apparently picked up bad habits like smoking and drinking alcohol. When Donald's father went to prison, he began moving around to distant relatives until he was finally taken in by his maternal uncle and aunt, who lived in the same township as Robbie's family. Donald was known primarily for his animal cruelty and for regularly bullying small children. This is probably why none of the local residents let their children play with him. Unlike Robbie, who was loved by everyone, Donald didn't get along particularly well with anyone, had no close friends, and seemed to do nothing but chase after the younger children he envied. Investigators became aware of Donald after seeing him on television commenting on the events. The teenager gave several impromptu interviews to 2 different news stations, in which he said that he believed Rex might have set Robbie on fire. In a conversation with a reporter, Donald mentioned details that only someone personally present in the woods at the time of the attack could have known. He also mentioned that he had recently played with gasoline and burned his hand, and that he was having nightmares about what had happened to Robbie. To continue the investigation, investigators met with Robbie and his mother on July 31, 1998, and recorded the conversation. According to the boy, he didn't have time to see the perpetrator clearly because he was attacked from behind. He said he saw a piece of paper, a canister, and some dogs. Furthermore, Robbie said that just before he was set on fire, he heard a car door slam. He thought that one of the attackers might be Donald, as he recognized his voice. However, he also mentioned a voice that belonged to an older man. It should be noted, however, that at the time of the conversation, Robbie was under the influence of a large amount of pain and sedative medication, so his thoughts might not have been entirely clear. This meant that his testimony could not be taken seriously. A few days later, however, investigators spoke with Robbie's mother again, and she explained that this time her son not only named his attackers, but also provided some details about what they had done to him. Based on this information, investigators obtained an arrest warrant for Donald. During the interrogation, the teenager admitted that he was indeed involved in the attack on Robbie. In the juvenile detention center, he repeatedly threatened other youths, promising to set them on fire just like Robbie. Some of them told the detention center director, who then contacted investigators to pass on the information. According to the testimony of one of the youths, Donald said he only set Robbie on fire because he and his uncle had induced him to perform intimate acts in the past. They were even afraid that he might tell his parents. According to the teenager, Donald also said that he found it funny how Robbie's eyes looked after he set him on fire. He thought they were going to pop out of his head. Despite all these claims, the prosecution decided to drop the case against Donald, and by January 2000 he was free again. The main reason for this outcome was perhaps Robbie's contradictory statements about the identity of his attacker, and despite his family's efforts to get justice, the investigation into the case stalled. For the next 13 years, Robbie's life was a constant struggle. He spent much of his time in medical centers, where he underwent surgeries and painful treatments, having to endure over 150 operations. But his spirit was never broken. Thanks to the unconditional support of his family members, he became a true symbol of resilience and courage. Robbie was even able to return to everyday life and go back to school. However, things did not go as favorably as he would have wished. He was immediately mocked by some of his classmates because of his appearance, but his will and his acceptance of reality led many people around him to show understanding. Despite everything that happened to him, he showed incredible courage every day. Furthermore, he managed to care for more than just himself. He often met with other victims of similar crimes, thus becoming a kind of advocate. Robbie even started a campaign to raise funds for transplant research. His compassion and selflessness were another reminder of the things that are truly important. While Robbie became a true role model for many citizens, Donald preferred to continue on his criminal path. In 2001, at the age of 16, he was convicted of an offense against the sexual integrity of an 8-year-old child. For this offense, he spent only about 4 years in prison. After that, his life was like a sequence of events consisting of regular prison stays. It is important to mention that Robbie never doubted that Donald was responsible for what had happened to him. Perhaps that is why he and his relatives filed a civil lawsuit in 2010, accusing him of attempted murder. The first glimmer of hope for justice came perhaps when the Middletons enlisted the help of Craig Seco, a civil attorney, who helped them file the lawsuit against Donald. Craig's idea was to get a copy of the police report and find a legal way to reopen the criminal case. He later managed to obtain the most important investigation files, take a statement from one of the investigators, and speak with Robbie's treating physicians. Unfortunately, Robbie's condition deteriorated dramatically during the legal proceedings, and although he stubbornly fought against the consequences of the attack, he had already been diagnosed with skin cancer by this time, which ultimately cost him his life at the end of April 2011. In a final act of bravery, he recorded a 27-minute video in which he told the truth about the events of that fateful day, as well as some other details that he had carefully kept to himself the whole time. Thus, Robbie told of the events that had occurred in the weeks before the arson. According to him, Donald had forcibly taken him to the same place and pressured him into intimacy. Robbie claimed he only did this because he had witnessed Donald luring another 8-year-old boy into intimacy. He also mentioned that on the day Donald set him on fire, he thought he heard the voice of an adult man who could have been the attacker's uncle. After recording this statement, Robbie left our world. A few days later, dozens of people came to his funeral to show their solidarity. While Robbie's relatives struggled with the pain of their loss, his lawyer continued to participate in the trial and brought new evidence into the case. In early September 2011, Donald, who had recently been in prison, was free again. 3 months later, the next phase of the civil trial took place. After the jury watched a video that Robbie had recorded shortly before his death, they delivered a symbolic verdict, awarding his relatives compensation in the amount of $150 billion. This was the highest amount ever awarded in a civil lawsuit in the history of the United States of America. Although Robbie's parents were aware that they would never see the money, they saw the verdict as a success for justice for their son. Besides, money had never been their main goal. After the end of the civil trial, the Montgomery County Sheriff's Office and District Attorney's Office announced that they would reopen the investigation. And it must be said that the task was anything but easy. The new investigation included more than 200 interviews of possible witnesses, as well as obtaining expert reports from a variety of specialists. During the new investigation, investigators questioned virtually all previous witnesses and found those who had not testified in 1998. Two of these witnesses became key to the case. One of them was Donald's cousin. She testified that her cousin had confessed to her on the night in question that he had tied Robbie to a tree with a fishnet, then doused him with gasoline and set him on fire. When she told one of her family members about it, they said the adults would take care of it. Undoubtedly, there were many legal problems in this case, most of which had to do with the fact that Donald was only 13 years old at the time of the crime. Nevertheless, everyone involved in this case was determined to help Robbie and his family get justice and to prevent Donald from remaining free. In 2012, the prosecutor in charge of the investigation applied to the district court for permission to try Donald as an adult. Of course, he was already of legal age by this time, but one must not forget that he was not yet 18 years old at the time of the crime. In his formal response, the district judge stated that prosecutors have every right to try cases involving juveniles as adults at their own discretion. However, he made no specific findings regarding this case. Thereupon, the prosecutor decided to prosecute Donald as an adult on the basis of a Texas law that came into force in 1999, 1 year after the actual attack on Robbie. Until that time, the minimum age for a teenager to be considered an adult was 14 years, but with the new regulations, it was lowered to 10 years. The prosecutor insisted that Donald should be subject to the new rules since Robbie had died in 2011. The perpetrator's lawyer, in turn, argued that certifying his client as an adult was unlawful, as the change in the law had only occurred 1 year after the actual attack. In other words, this meant that Donald should have been sentenced under the laws in effect in 1998. At Donald's formal certification hearing to be tried as an adult, several witnesses testified that he had personally confessed the crime to them. Ultimately, the judge concluded that Donald should be certified as an adult and receive a harsher sentence for the murder or manslaughter of Robbie. After this decision, the case was handed over to the prosecutor's office. Due to the great attention the case received not only in 1998, but also during the civil trial, Donald's defense filed a motion for a change of venue. The judge later granted the motion on the grounds that the extensive media coverage of the case could have affected the impartiality of the jury. As a result, the case was moved to a neighboring county, which led to some logistical difficulties for the prosecution's witnesses. Most of them, at least 40 people, were low-income individuals who could not afford to take time off from work, had no transportation of their own, and could not cover the living expenses in another city. Only with difficulty did the representatives of the prosecution manage to compel most of the key prosecution witnesses to testify. However, another problem arose. About 10 witnesses were people who had been in juvenile detention with Donald in 1998. They were all still in the Texas Department of Criminal Justice at the beginning of the trial. Despite these inconveniences, Donald's trial began in 2015. Due to the overall complexity of the case, the prosecutors decided to forego a traditional linear narrative. Instead, they began with the testimony of one of Robbie's treating physicians, who described in detail his injuries, his state of mind, and the true cause of his death. At the pretrial hearing, the judge excluded Donald's confession to attacking Robbie as key evidence. The prosecutors were therefore forced to find other ways to convey the nature of the events to the jury. One of the most important pieces of evidence was the video of Robbie's testimony. It was particularly important because it confirmed that Donald had attacked him to cover up another, equally serious crime. During the trial, the jury watched the videotape repeatedly. In it, Robbie said Donald had set him on fire after he had gotten him to be intimate with him. For the lead prosecutor, it was perfectly clear that Donald had set Robbie on fire to prevent him from speaking about another crime. And although Robbie himself repeatedly said he had heard the voice of an adult man at the time of the attack, the authorities never found any evidence of the other man's presence. While all 12 jurors watched Robbie's testimony spellbound, Donald defiantly turned his back to the screen and began to read something. Immediately afterward, his representative said that the prosecutors were deliberately playing with the jurors' feelings and emotions because they had no real witnesses to the attack. At a certain point, the prosecution called another witness to the stand, Donald's cousin. She testified that the defendant had confessed to her that he was the one who had carried out the attack on Robbie. The witnesses who had been in the juvenile detention center with Donald in 1998 were also called to testify. They all spoke about the confessions the defendant had made while in custody. It should be noted that the prosecutors also spoke about other crimes Donald had committed. They specifically mentioned his offenses against the sexual integrity of a 6-year-old girl and an 8-year-old boy. On February 9, 2015, a jury of 7 women and 5 men found 29-year-old Donald Wilborn Collins guilty of murder and sentenced him to 40 years in prison. When he heard this verdict, he showed no emotion. Colleen, Robbie's mother, said for her part that her son would have been satisfied with this result, as Donald would no longer be able to harm another child. Even at the sentencing, she was called as a witness to speak about her son and all that they had been through in recent years. And although the verdict practically guaranteed that he would spend a significant part of his life in prison, it was not enough for Robbie's relatives. The prosecutors and investigators involved in the case were satisfied with the verdict, because after 17 years, justice had finally been served. Donald's lead defense attorney, for his part, said he considered the sentence too harsh. He also appealed the court's decision to try his client as an adult for a crime committed as a juvenile. Furthermore, he argued that the prosecution had relied exclusively on circumstantial evidence during the trial. According to him, there was not a single piece of physical evidence or a witness statement that would have proven the assault and the violation of Robbie's sexual integrity. Despite all the arguments and efforts of Donald's defense, all 3 appellate courts upheld the conviction. The last of these rulings was announced in October 2017. After all appeal options within the state were exhausted, the possibility arose for Donald's lawyers to go to a federal court. However, no information could be found to confirm a new appeal. To this day, Donald is incarcerated in a maximum security prison in the state of Texas. He will not be eligible for parole until the year 2033. Undoubtedly, Robbie's story is a painful reminder of the cruelty that lurks in people and of the incredible strength and courage of a little boy who did not give up and fought until the end. Robbie went through a lot to be able to lead a normal life again, and in the end, he was able to get justice, but this path was too painful. Thank you for watching and take care of yourself.